Welcome all to the second installment of How Would I Change, with today's subject being Titania. It's been a little while since the first episode, for those of you who may have seen it, but hey, better late than never. We're going to change up the format a little bit this time. This time I'm going to go through each ability. I'm going to explain how they currently function, the issues I have with their current functionality, the changes I would make, and then a little bit of a clarification over why and how I made those changes. So let's just jump right in, why don't we? Starting with Titania's passive, called Dust Bloom. Dust Bloom boosts Titania's bullet jump distance by 25% at all times. Additionally, whenever she performs a bullet jump, she will create a small trampoline that will also boost any allies' bullet jumps by 25% if they jump from that area. Honestly, I don't have any issues with this passive. I think it's fine. It helps Titania all the time, and it's very, very consistent and useful for a squad buff, so there's really no issues, and I would not make any changes to it at all. Sadly, I cannot say the same for her first ability, called Spellbind. Spellbind causes all enemies within 5 meters of the target location to become weightless for the next 16 seconds. They will also drop their weapons if they have any, and they will have to retrieve them from the location they were spellbound from after the weightlessness ends before they can use them again. There's really only one issue I have with Spellbind, and that is how restrictive it is to Titania's movement. It is a full body animation, meaning that she cannot move and must stand completely still for its fairly lengthy casting animation. Now this is a problem because Titania's survivability comes from her being able to move around rapidly and constantly. So to remedy this issue, I would simply make the animation upper body only, meaning that she can cast the ability while in the air and while moving. One thing I do a lot when I'm thinking of changes and fixes for Warframes is I also theorize ways that they could be more interesting and have added effect. So my next change, which I don't think is necessary at all, but could be cool, is to make it so that all spellbound enemies take double damage from Titania's other abilities. And with those two things, I feel like Spellbind would be much smoother and less disruptive and annoying to use in combat, and it would also have just a little bit more interaction with her other abilities. So now on to her second ability, called Tribute. Tribute needs a lot, but is surprisingly not Titania's worst ability. As it stands, Tribute targets a single enemy, dealing 500 damage, and reducing that enemy's damage output by 25% for the next 12 seconds. The target enemy will also drop a soul, which, when picked up, will grant 1 stack of one of 4 different buffs, depending on the enemy targeted. The first buff is called Dust, which reduces the accuracy of enemies within 30 meters by 10% for each stack. It lasts 120 seconds. The second buff, called Thorns, reflects 5% of the damage taken by Titania back to the attacker. It also lasts 120 seconds. Entangle slows down the movement speed of enemies within 10 meters by 5% per stack. It also lasts 120 seconds. And finally we have Full Moon, which increases the damage of companions by 15%. It lasts 90 seconds. Now you may have heard the durations of those buffs and been like, wow, those last a really long time, that's cool. No, that is cool, but there's only one problem. It doesn't scale. Neither does any of the other values of those buffs. Nothing scales. Which is my first and biggest problem with this ability. And as far as I know, it is the only ability in the game that just doesn't scale at all. On top of that, it mirrors the exact same issues I had with her first ability, being that it is extremely restrictive to movement and disrupts gameplay. And to top all that off, it just does not do meaningful damage. So, how do we fix that? 'Cause that's a lot. Well, we'll start with the easy stuff. We'll do the exact same thing to this ability that we did with the first ability. making an upper body animation and speeding up the animation just a little bit. We will also make every single buff scale with each of their respective mods. But because of that, we're going to reduce the base durations to 12 seconds and 9 seconds respectively. Before you call out, "Oh, that's 1/10 of the ability duration, that's a huge nerf," just wait, because there's more. The stacks from each buff will now only decay one at a time, instead of the entire thing going away at once. And since each buff stacks 5 times, that means that the duration is effectively halved instead of reduced to 1/10. And a nice quality of life change that I think would be very, very helpful on Titania would be making it so that the souls, after being extracted, would slowly float towards Titania, meaning you don't have to jump directly on top of them to collect them. And finally, in the same vein as the second change I made to Spellbind, I would make it so that each stack of each buff would increase the damage of Tribute by 10%. I do this to create a positive feedback loop of getting more buffs and dealing more damage. And on top of that, to make it so that even if you have all of the buffs stacked all the way up, there's still a reason to cast the ability. So all of that accumulates to make an ability that is smoother and less disruptive, not annoying, actually worth modding for, and always worth casting. So, now that we got that one patched up, we have the wonderful pleasure of taking a look at her third ability, Lantern. Currently, Lantern causes a single enemy to begin floating around similarly to Spellbind, dealing damage in a very, very small area around themselves, and attracting enemies within 25 meters towards them. When the ability ends, either by its duration running out or by being cancelled, the primary target will release an explosion over 8 meters, dealing 2,500 damage. Just like Tribute, all this sounds fine and dandy on paper, but it actually has a huge issue. That little floating away weightlessly thing that's in there basically makes this ability completely useless in almost all situations. What happens is, they'll start floating away, and if literally anything touches them at all, they will begin floating away from where you want them to be, and generally up into the air. And once they get high enough, they are no longer affecting anything at all on the ground, so it's just doing nothing. So to fix that, I would simply make it so that the target does not float away weightlessly. Instead, they just levitate above the ground stationary, so that they don't end up being out of range of any enemy that you might want to be attracted by it. And just one more quick note before I move on. For those who might complain that I'm removing functionality, I would still make it so that if the enemy is spellbound before or after Lantern is cast, they will still float away weightlessly. Now, the other change I make to this ability is because you can only have one out at a time. It needs to have a larger area of influence. So, I would buff the damage range to 5 meters, the explosion range to 10, and the attraction range to 25. And with those two changes, I think that this ability would be great, because it would have a bigger area of impact, and it would actually be worth casting in the first place. And now, we get to Titania's fourth ability, called Razor Wing. When casting Razor Wing, Titania will shrink down into a little pixie, and she will pull out her signature weapons, the Dex Pixia and the Dewata, and she will also gain 50% evasion. She also summons 6 little razor flies to fly around, distracting enemies and dealing damage. And just like her passive, I really don't think there's any problems with this. The only issue I would mention is simply the amount of forma you need to max it all the way out. But that's a topic for another video. So, we made it all the way through all the changes. And to quickly summarize before I end off this video, the main goals with this were just to make Titania's 1 and 2 less disruptive to gameplay, make it easier to get in and out, fix Tribute's many problems, make Lantern actually useful, and maintain her caster spammy playstyle, which is reinforced even more by her augment for her 4. And I really wanted to avoid too many drastic changes. I wanted to keep her as much the same as I could, but fixing all of her issues at the same time. And that's about it. So let me know if you liked the video. Let me know if there's any changes in format you think might be better. I'll see you soon. I think next time is gonna be Boobin. Good old Boobin. He needs it. So see you next time.